Buddy. As Plune said, my name is Ryan Connery. I'm with the Mass History Alliance Commons Committee, and we'd like to welcome you to the second installment of a new series of the History Studio, an online platform hosted by the Mass History Alliance. The History Studio is open to anyone in any subject in Massachusetts history in any form, subject to the approval of the Mass History Alliance Commons Committee. If you're interested in showing a film, presenting a topic, trying out a talk or workshop, or showing your research, fill out a form. The link will be posted in the chat, and the committee will get back to you within a reasonable amount of time. You will be responsible for providing PR language and an image, and we will schedule a Zoom meeting, send out the information via our usual channels, and provide you with a host to run the IT and open the program. The rest is up to you. The series is on authors and publishing in Massachusetts history. It is created and hosted by a member of the Commons team, Plune Borisius. She has self-published 4 of her own books and has developed an interest in the state of publishing in Massachusetts history. Our conversation with Jane Siaka can be seen
Oh,
online at the Commons Archive, and there should be a link in the chat to that as well.
I'll put it in.
Thank you. On March 21st, we're doing a conversation on the Commons with Mary Doherty of UMass Press and Aaron Vojan with Arcadia Publishing, as well as a history studio with author Elizabeth Sheehy on April 2nd. Details are forthcoming on those. You can check back on the events calendar on the Mass History Commons website. So before we start, there's a few housekeeping items. Once we start the conversation, please keep your microphone muted until you are called on. It helps to lower the background noise. This is meant to be an informal conversation, so we invite you to turn on your video and participate. Let us know if you have something to say by raising your hand, so you can go into the participants list and then use the hand raise function. If you're on the phone, just ask to break in. If we get Zoom bombed, we will immediately close the conversation and send you a new link for a new meeting to start immediately. So look at your email if that happens. Luckily, it hasn't happened since I've been here. So after today's conversation, please leave us with a survey response. We'll put a survey link in the chat. For those of you following the live stream on the Commons site, there's a link to the survey in the Commons archive, in the Conversations archive. So we'd like to thank MHA's top sponsors, Mass Humanities, the State Historical Records Advisory Board, Mike Pataski, and the Dorchester Historical Society. You can find all of our sponsors on the Commons website. The link will also be in the chat. We'd like to invite you to list your organization in the Commons directory and/or sponsor the Commons. Everything costs money, so if you can only spare $25, we'd gladly have it. And now for the main event. I'd like to introduce our moderator for tonight. That'll be Plune Borisius. Historian and building contractor Plune Borisius is a member of the Commons Committee. She is the principal of Swift River Press, Public History and Communications, working with historical organizations on their planning and projects, as well as the management of their historic buildings, and was the founding president of the Mass History Alliance. Previously, she was the assistant director of Mass Humanities and lecturer in history and literature at Harvard University. Her alter ego is writer and photographer Agatha O, and she is at work on a book about her family's activities in the Netherlands and England during World War II. So take it away, Plune.
Thank you, Ryan.
You're welcome.
Thank you for being here. So today, in this history studio, we're going to talk about photography. Massachusetts is littered with the remains of public and private buildings and landscapes, hospitals, factories, churches, houses, and harbors. For our second installment in the new history studio series on authors and publishing in Massachusetts history, join us for a conversation with architect, designer, and photographer David Whitemyer. We will be talking about the making and publishing of his gorgeous book, Abandoned Massachusetts, which he published in 2020, in which he directs his camera at many of these structures. And the series is really about find out more about history gets published. David Whitemyer is an amateur self-taught photographer who has been exploring modern ruins since his adolescence in the early 1980s. He grew up in the Chicago suburbs and currently lives in southeastern Mass with his wife, sons, and cats. In addition to his photographs, David's passion for history and architecture is demonstrated through his 25 years of work in the museum and exhibition planning professor, and is a designer, architect, project manager, writer, and adjunct faculty member. Welcome, David.
Thanks for having me. I'm jealous that you have an alter ego. I want one.
I know it's wonderful to have one because you can always go hide behind it, right? So
Yeah.
all you have to do is publish things under a different name, and then
Yeah.
you have one.
Thank
Um,
yeah, thanks very much for having me. I appreciate it.
Good. So today we're going to talk about your book, Abandoned Massachusetts. And there's three things I think that we're going to address. First of all, what's in the book? Secondly, what got you into this? How did you do it? How did you make a book? And the third is what made you publish and tell us about essentially tell us about the process. So I have a number of questions on each of those,
Great.
which I'll ask you, and then we'll just take it away and talk.
Yeah,
But meanwhile, for all the people here, um, we will uh, we will definitely be interested in taking your comments and as we are doing this, right? David is open to, and so am I, to people sticking up their hand and saying, "Okay, I want to get in." Or if we don't notice you for jumping in, but we'll notice you. And the main reason that we ask you to keep your mic off is simply because it creates a lot of background noise to have a lot of people with open mics, and that makes the video really hard to hear for a lot of people. So I wanted to ask you about Abandoned Massachusetts, which is a compilation of gorgeous photographs of abandoned places. And what drew you to abandoned places?
um, I get that question a lot. So yeah, it's a tough. Gosh, I've answered it so many times, I've forgotten what the canned answer is. I've been drawn to them since I was a little kid. When I was a pre-tween, my father and I used to go camping a lot out west, Colorado, Wyoming, those types of places. We would explore a number of ghost towns, or we would pass an abandoned gas station or some other structure on the side of the road. And my father was also keen on getting a camera in my hand when I was very young, and um, he would encourage the exploration. So if I wanted to spend a day in a ghost town, he was all for it. If I asked him to stop on the side of a road to look at an abandoned service station, he was all for it. And even in the suburb where I lived, I grew up in Wheaton, Illinois. There were some abandoned structures there, and as a tween and a pre-tween, my friends and I would sneak into them and explore. So I was always sort of drawn to them. And again, with my father putting a camera in my hand early, I was taking pictures. And then, through my adolescence, did it every once in a while. And then when I was in college, I went to architecture school in Iowa. And if you've ever driven through Iowa, you can go for hours and hours and hours on any given rural highway and pass a number of abandoned farmhouses and barns and other aging structures. And I often did that by myself on the weekends. And I would head out with a couple rolls of film and my camera and stop on the side of the road and walk across a field and sneak into old buildings.
It's such magic, and in some ways we're so lucky to have a lot of these abandoned shells, if you will, like a
Yeah.
hermit crab, right? With shells we've grown out of. And um, so one thing that I do a lot of exploring of cellar holes and mill foundations because that's what we have here in the hills in Western Mass.
Yeah.
And a lot of what I do is I try to figure out what was here and what was it like, and what was. I try to conjure up what was here. Do you do any of that when you're in a place like that? Is it the mystery? Is it the magic? Do you have any way of putting your finger on?
I mean, that's a huge part of the thrill is just to imagine uh, not just what was there physically, like I know, Plune, if you're exploring mill foundations and other things in the woods of Massachusetts, little tricks like, if you see a fruit tree, right, that's typically close to where a house was, right? Because they don't usually just pop up naturally. So, and if you see a fruit tree, you can start looking for home foundations and things like that. Whether I'm in a factory or a hospital, a church, or even somebody's home, there is a thrill in trying to imagine that the space was filled with energy, with palpable energy, with excitement, with joy, with sorrow, and I think along with that, this is especially true in factories when I see something like an oily glove on a work desk or a dried coffee cup, and I just think like this place was filled with energy, people coming every day, talking with each other about their families and what they were doing. And one day, people were told like you don't need to come back tomorrow, right? And somebody was the last person to shut the door. So there is a little bit of a, I don't know if thrill is the right word, but it's certainly a fascination to imagine that.
Yeah, there's a sort of a sweet sadness to it as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah.
You wonder whether it was suddenly all over or whether it petered out or whatever.
Yeah.
Um, and another thing so I I don't have a good way. I mean, I could start pulling up your photographs and sharing the screen, and I will do a little bit of that, but I don't have a good way to really show your photos right now. And I would encourage people to look at your photographs if they haven't seen your book, to look at them online. And I'm putting your link to your website
Oh,
uh,
thank you. Yeah.
to
I have
your
a, I have
portfolio.
a, I have a, I have a, I have a few photos ready to share if,
Oh, okay,
if,
good.
if a story kind of draws us to it,
That's
I'll pull them
that's
up.
great.
Yeah.
That's good. That's good. So what do you know about a place? Do you walk through the woods without a goal? And I'm sure you know something about a place when you get there.
Yeah, usually, I mean, I usually before I go somewhere, I know that it exists as an abandoned location. And as far as its history, it depends. Sometimes I know nothing, and maybe just because of the timing didn't allow me to dig into it. Sometimes I do a lot of research, and I even go into the place having seen some old black and white or sepia images of people in those spaces. Um, so I kind of know what some of the spaces look like lived in before I get there. Sometimes it's a little bit of the history. Again, like if I'm going into a factory, I might go in knowing what they manufactured there, when they opened, when they closed, and that type of thing. But I usually do a little bit more research after I've been somewhere, just because I get excited after seeing it and I want to learn more.
That's how I work.
Yeah,
It's like going to a country or any place, and then suddenly you're like, "How did this get here?
right.
What did this come?" And then you're really like, yeah, the visual really starts to get you going, and it's
Yeah, I mean, and part of knowing that history is knowing why places are where they are. When I'm doing research for places, and sometimes I learn about a place because a friend in our odd community of abandoned photographers might share something with me. But more often than not, especially here in New England, I spend a lot of time on Google Earth following railroad tracks or following rivers or following rural highways because that's where the abandoned stuff is. And especially when things are on rivers and railroad tracks, that tells you a lot about the history to begin with.
hmm really cool. There's somebody, S. Bowen made a comment that I think is really interesting. Thank you for that. He said he's from Arizona and says Arizona is replete with abandoned buildings. And he says, as architects, it's a rich opportunity. Do you feel that there's something between this and your study of architecture, that like old factory buildings and
I'm
and
guess I'm if he's willing, I'm curious about that comment a little bit. Is it an opportunity for architects because there are interesting structures that can have a second life and we can do something with? Or is it an interesting opportunity because there's some aspect of their design and detailing that we can learn from and duplicate on contemporary buildings.
S. Bowen, we're putting you on the spot.
The buildings in Arizona are well beyond architecture. But they do tell you a lot about people, how people lived in the desert. And
Yeah.
we have mountains as well. And the, the evolution of the societies that are long gone, and we know little about, are lessons in how we place our buildings now. So especially here in the Sun State.
So you're talking more about less about buildings that were built in the 60s and 50s that are abandoned and things closer to like what we see at Mesa Verde.
Correct.
Yeah, got it.
I think it's really true about siting buildings, though. I've really learned a lot about, as you know, certainly I'm not exactly a builder, but as a person who works in construction, I've learned a lot about locations where people always used to locate their houses. And of course, around here, people would come and, they're not exactly professionals building their houses, and yet they had a real practice about locating their houses in certain directions and on knolls and stuff like that. It's
Well, I think
just
interesting, thinking about like, Mesa Verde and other old structure. I mean, I know that's in southwest corner of Colorado, but also, similar abandoned structures from indigenous tribes. I mean, you're familiar with, just north of Phoenix, what Arco Santi and what Paulo Soleri did there, I think was an interesting attempt at taking some of those building techniques, cooling techniques, and other types of community landscape, urban design, and architecture from those indigenous tribes and incorporate them into contemporary architecture.
Several architects here who use rammed earth. And so it has a long, long history. But you would not find that in New England, but you would
No,
have
you would not.
to.
Nope, nope. The rain would sort of crumble that, wouldn't it?
now, although people are starting to do all sorts of experiments. Um, I want to show a couple of photographs. So maybe you want to show something. When I look at your portfolio, I really wonder about people's tendency to create something and then abandoning it. And do you think that's particularly American? Is it because we feel we have so much space? I would love for you to show a couple of your photographs.
Sure. Yeah, I'll pull up a couple in just a second. It's an interesting question. I mean, I don't think anybody builds a structure with the intention of abandoning it. So I don't think that's uniquely American, unless there's something unique about our economy that not encourages, but pushes an ease of abandoned structures. I mean,
That's what I mean. Yeah.
right, buildings are abandoned for a host of different reasons. Maybe a company, or some organization goes bankrupt, or a community goes under because it's a boom or bust type of economy in that community, and a number of structures go down. Or, oftentimes when I see abandoned houses, and there's plenty of those, we each drive by them every day, and I sort of half jokingly drive by them and assume that was the result of a bad divorce, because many of them are. They happen all the time, and the properties are given up. And then what happens is the buildings start to decay, and then the cost of renovating them is prohibitively expensive. The cost of renovating something exceeds the value that you would get from that building after renovating it. So they sit vacant. So again, I don't think anybody intends to abandon them, and there's a host of mostly economic reasons that they get abandoned, and then economic reasons and regulation reasons why they're not renovated. If you look at my book, I mean, you'll see, beautiful theaters, again, factories that could be reimagined as, for modern manufacturing, or artist studios, or apartments, or things like that. And in the United States, just things like the simple cost of hazardous abatement removal, getting rid of lead paints and getting rid of asbestos, is so prohibitively expensive. If you're one of the owners of these vacant properties, it is much more advantageous to you to let it slowly sink into the ground and become nothing, and then shovel it up, than it is to pay for hazardous abatement removal because the value is in the land, not the building.
Yeah. So you
Yeah.
think that's the reason that they don't take them down? Because if you think of what might be connected to the idea of space is the fact of not taking a building down, but
Yeah.
instead.
Right. And when you every once
Yeah.
in a while when you hear about an abandoned structure that just happened to catch on fire, you can see where I'm
Yes,
going
that's
with
right.
that.
I
Right.
grew up with that. For
Right.
sure, but that was not in the US. So
Yeah.
so definitely. So I invite you to share. The reason I'm hesitant about doing it is that I don't know what in your portfolio is exactly in the book. So, and you do. So
Well, let me here. I'll jump around. I grabbed just sort of a selection of photos, the only photos that were in the book. So again, if some of you all look at the link that Plune sent that goes to my website, you'll see a host of different photos. But what I set up here, just in case it came up, were some miscellaneous photos from my book. So can you all see this?
yep.
All right, there we go. All right, I'll jump around here. I'm not, and I'm gonna go pretty fast.
Right.
But if there's questions about any of these, and specifically, raise your hand or dump something in the chat. So, and these are sort of arranged similarly to how they're arranged in the book, where I sort of go through, factories and manufacturing spaces, power plants, military spaces, hospitals, schools, and theaters. I think churches are mingled in there as well. And then within those categories, they're kind of chronologically organized. So again, I'll jump on a few. This is actually from a factory in Whitman, Massachusetts. It was a cotton gin factory. One of the reasons this space is so interesting, according to the Massachusetts Paranormal Association or the Paranormal Society, this is one of the most haunted locations in Massachusetts. And I've been in here a few times because I met a gentleman who owns this, and he's let me in a few times, and he has stories about people seeing gray blobs in the distance. He has stories about people taking their dogs into the space, and then the dogs will never cross a certain pathway. So if you're wondering, no, I never experienced any paranormal activities in this space. But it is a fascinating space. There was another thing I wanted to show you in Taunton, Massachusetts.
Wow.
There's a factory, and now I forget what it's called, but I was driving through Taunton one day, and there was beautiful old factory, and I got out of my car and I was sort of looking into the windows, and it looked like there was an office that may um, still be used. And while I was looking in the windows, this elderly gentleman pulled up and got out, and it turned out he was like the son of the owner of this factory. And I told him what I was doing and what I was interested in, and he sort of said come on in. He was trying to get this building on the National Historic Register. So he asked, if I took some photos, would I share the photos with him so that he can use them for his registration application? So he did that, and that happens frequently, which is it's usually an easy invitation to get welcomed into a building, is to offer to share my photos so that people can use them for fundraising or historical registration applications and things like this. But this was a really interesting factory because it was opened uh, just before the Civil War, and it was active until 2014. So as recently as 10 years ago, this factory was active, not necessarily in this room, but in an adjacent room. So it started as an umbrella factory prior to the Civil War, and then just after the Civil War, it was taken over under new ownership. And from just after the Civil War, they started manufacturing shoe buttons and upholstery tacks, which into the 20th century turned into insulated staples. And again, there are some rooms in this factory that are filled with boxes of insulated staples from as recently as 2013 and 14. And what this elderly gentleman was doing his remaining work was trying to sell their existing inventory. But it was interesting. This was a space in here. I don't know if you've ever this is one of the things that I love about this. You learn so many things. I had never heard the term, uh, I think it's pronounced Japanning, not Japaning, but Japanning, as a technique. And it's where you basically sort of a porcelain, it's how you bake porcelain enamel on steel to make different types of buttons and snaps and things like that. And these are the racks in which you would put all the trays of buttons and other things ready for Japanning, and then slip them into these ovens so that the porcelain bakes. So again, I didn't know that walking into this building, and I walked around, and this very kind gentleman told me all about it. So you get to learn quite a lot doing this.
I think it's like an early form of powder coating almost.
That's exactly right, Plume. Yes, right.
And so if I look at the first photograph, I
This
see
one?
no, the other one, the one that we just had. I see all these wheels here, which are still from the old belts that ran the factory, I bet.
That's right. But and then every once in a while you would find one of the straps of leather just sitting about,
Right, right.
right?
So
Because
it
when
must
these
have
things were
been,
being run, there was leather belts all over the place.
yeah. So it must have been water powered. So
Yep,
I think likely.
that,
Wonderful. What a
that's
wonderful.
right. So any of you from New England have probably seen this type of architecture a million times because these buildings are on every river, every railroad track, and in every single town. So. You find some incredible details in these spaces. This is actually from that factory that I just mentioned. Um, I don't know if anybody on the call is from or familiar with Taunton, where the Reed and Barton factory was, which at one point was the largest silversmith in the world. It was another one that their campus has something like, I don't know, 17 different buildings on it, and they were an active silversmith probably until around 2015 or 16 is when they finally went bankrupt and closed their doors. And their buildings, this is one of them, littered with beautiful spaces, also littered with silver all over the place. This was one of their painting studios. So again, I'll go quickly. So again, in Massachusetts, especially around Hingham and Quincy, it was a huge shipbuilding area. I think in Hingham and Quincy built most of the ships from in World War II and World War I. This building has, I believe, this one has since been demolished. Most of these have been since been demolished. Again, and some of these books and stories are in my book as well. This is a power station down in Somerset, which, if my information is correct, was recently demolished. And then, of course, some of you on the call have undoubtedly been out to the Boston Harbor Islands. So this was on George's Island. This is in the officers' quarters, but around the coast of Maine down all along Connecticut, there's just a ton of old fort remnants. But New England is littered with military abandoned military bases. There are quite a number of hospitals in Massachusetts. Some of them are single buildings. Some of them are, 20 to 30 buildings. A very, very popular one for photography is in Waltham, a place called Fernald. Again, I'm going very quickly, but stop me if you've got any questions on some of these. And again, it's not just like really old hospitals. There's a number of fairly new hospitals that are abandoned. This was part of the Quincy Medical Center that was abandoned just within the last 10 years. Um, this was a middle school, very common. Again, jumping around. There are loads of churches, not as many as there were just a few years ago. These tend to get demolished very quickly because there's no nearly zero chance of renovating these into something, except this one actually in Brighton, Massachusetts, near I think it's St. Elizabeth Hospital. Some amazing developer took this church and converted it into apartment buildings and maintained this whole nave area as the apartment lobby. And it's quite beautiful. So it's still got all the columns, it's got the arch ceiling, it's got the dome ceiling at the end of it, and it's all part of the building. And then lastly, theaters. There's a number of great ones in Massachusetts. This is the Orpheum Theater down in New Bedford. Interestingly, the opening day of this theater was the same day that the Titanic sank. And then the theater closed, I believe it was in the early 50s, and it has remained untouched since the early 50s. And this one, along with like this Victory Theater in Holyoke, these theaters all have nonprofit organizations that are doing fundraising, trying to raise money to restore these spaces, but the sad reality is they will probably never be restored. I mean, you can look at these spaces and you know that this is a multi-million dollar endeavor to try to restore this. And in a city like New Bedford, Massachusetts, there just isn't the economy to imagine the revenue that this place would need to stay open. So there's
Thank
just there's just a smattering.
I think your photos are wonderful.
Thank
Uh,
you.
I do feel that if we had that with some proper public investment, we could do some of that. But that's my own feeling about that.
Well, I mean, Balloon, I think so. I mean, there's two parts to it because that's interesting. Certainly, there's enough. If there was some public investment, you could renovate a theater. But then the question is, who's going to go to the theater, right? And again, you've got a town like New Bedford or Holyoke, Massachusetts, both of which are depressed, struggling towns, and there's it's just not feasible.
No, I know it's thought of as not feasible, but it's very sad. In any
It is
case,
very
um,
sad.
so I want to ask you, I would, people on the call would get upset with me if I didn't ask you about your equipment, because I know as a photographer myself that people are forever asking me about my equipment, even though I'm not a gear buff. So tell me a little bit about what kind of equipment you use to take these kinds of photographs.
This guy right here. Um,
Is
so
that a medium format camera?
it
Camera?
is no, it's a full frame DSLR. I use Nikon. I actually have a couple of Nikons. The one I use most frequently is a Z6. So which means that it's mirrorless. There's no moving shutter in it. And again, any of you that are into photography know that most camera manufacturers are moving to mirrorless technology, so there's no mechanical shutters in them anymore. But I've got a couple of Nikons that I use. A couple of things come to mind. Most of my photos are very wide angle, right?
Mhm.
So I'm not using, I mean, I think this lens is a 14 to 13 millimeters. So with 14 millimeters, you can get extremely wide shots. Um, I think when I started doing this, and I was sort of self-taught. My widest lens was a 50 millimeter, which is kind of a tight frame. And if I go back and I look at some of those old photos that I took, I'm really disappointed and they're super crappy. And I wish I could go back to those locations and re-photograph them, but most of them have been torn down, so I can't. The other essential piece of equipment is a really good tripod. I don't use any artificial lighting in any of my pictures, no flash or anything like that. So nearly all of them are very long exposure photographs. So, I'm in the space and through the camera, I'm looking at the metering. And then because of the tripod, I might have the shutter open for, 20 to 30 seconds at a pop. So the other thing that I'll mention about equipment, if folks are just getting into any kind of photography, abandoned photography, or taking pictures of your grandkids or flowers in your garden, is so I had a neat experience this past weekend. I was in Illinois, and I was showing a new friend about how to take photographs in old buildings, and she had an incredible camera. She had a Nikon Z9. So again, if any of you know Nikons, it's an amazing camera. It can do anything. But she hadn't yet really taken the time to study it or do any research into it. And it's extremely common because there's so many amazing cameras out there, but it's really common now for people to plunk down, $3,000 to $6,000 on a good camera like this and assume that because it's an expensive camera, it's going to take really good photos. So they set it to automatic, and then they start taking pictures, and they look exactly like the ones on your iPhone, which they should, because this takes automatic photos. So if you're going to buy, a $3,000 to $4,000 camera, it's really important to never put it on automatic and really take some time through, online YouTube tutorials or books to learn about all of the features that it has. Like, what does ISO mean? What shutter speed do you want in different environments? What do you want your aperture to do? And what does that even mean? And that just takes time and practice. So, but again, just because you buy an expensive camera, it doesn't mean it takes good photos. You
I
take
have
good photos, right?
sorry,
You take good photos, not the camera.
that's right. You
Right.
take the photos. It's the camera is just a tool. So
That's
I
right.
have a question from Brian McSweeney. Go ahead.
Yes, I'm down here in the New Bedford area, and I'm familiar with it's actually called the Shooting Club.
Oh, right. It's up on the top floor.
Yeah, it was
Yeah,
designed by a bunch of guys that like to have a rifle range, and they put a rifle range down on the first floor. It was all the French factory workers, all the guys that worked in the mill. They had
that's
a
right.
fancy club, and they built this auditorium upstairs. The problem with that place is that we have another theater in town here in New Bedford called the Zeitarian Theater. It just got a $35 million grant that they're restoring, and it's the home of the New Bedford Symphony right now. And the actual downtown area is doing fairly well. And
Right.
I was trying
Down by the
to,
Whaling Museum. It's super vibrant.
yeah, no, the downtown historic areas, but they get the outskirts have still got problems with a lot of things in most poorer big cities. But that theater, I was in there and took some pictures, and I'm taking pictures of the outside in a book that I did. And I was kind of going to, well, we got to get this thing fixed up. And I was pounced on by all my friends that were on the boards of the Zeitarian Theater and said, the last thing we need in this town is another theater. We got one that's functioning very, very well right now. It's a beautiful theater, but it was built as a movie theater. It's not as beautiful as the interior of the uh, Majestic, which, as you said, opened when the Titanic sunk.
Yeah.
Uh, so no one's on board of restoring that thing right now because they figure we can only have one good theater in town. We already got one that's fixable, and this one is probably they've made stats. They've got some money, but they don't have anywhere near enough to get this thing off the ground. The other thing, it's in a tougher neighborhood. It's
Well,
in the
that's
south
yeah.
end.
I think you're right. The
It's in the
area.
south end of New Bedford, which is
Yeah.
it's down near the Fisherman Docks, and it's a lot of bars, a lot of night. People don't go there at night very much.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of other things that you have to take into consideration when you talk about restoring things. And New
And
Bedford's done a great job.
and reuse is more complex when it comes to a very specified space like a theater.
They were
very
using it as a
specialized.
grocery store. It was been a grocery store for a good
That's
part of
right.
it.
Yeah.
I would like to make a small transition and ask you about the making of a book and pulling together. What is it, the cart before the horse or the horse before the cart? Do you have photographs that say I'm going to make a book, or do you think to yourself, I'm a photographer, this is stuff I do, I'm going to make a book, let me go take photos. Tell me a little bit about your process, basically.
I honestly never thought about doing a book. I was just interested in sneaking into buildings and taking photos. And somebody from Font Hill Media, which is right connected through America Through Time, somebody from Font Hill Media reached out to me because, they have this series of abandoned books for different states, abandoned Ohio, abandoned New York, abandoned Illinois, abandoned Southern Connecticut, right? They've got them all over the place. Somebody reached out to me and I think they found me, they may have found me on Instagram or somewhere else and said, "Are you interested in doing the Abandoned Massachusetts book?" So he and I went back and forth just so I could understand what was involved in doing it, what might I be signing up for, what I might be gaining from it. Um, I coincidentally I happen to know the woman who did the Abandoned New York book. So I reached out to her and said, What's involved? How long did it take? What was it like working with the publisher and their editors?" Um, and actually in her situation, she's a great photographer. She did the photos, but she's not a writer, so she ended up having to pay somebody to do her own writing, which I wasn't interested in. So, I'm a fairly good writer, and I'm like, yeah, I'll do the writing and I'll do the photos. So, I said yes to the editor. I signed their contract, and they gave me the guidelines that it needed to meet. This many photos. This is the approximate word count. This is the formatting structure for submitting the text, and then it was sort of my creative license.
And you could do whatever you wanted in terms of what you wanted to put in.
Yep, yeah, pretty much. Yeah, I could create the story. I could organize the information however I wanted. And then, when I submitted the text, which would have been like spring, early summer of 2019. They had a couple of editors that went through it, and we went back and forth on a couple of things, but there wasn't much. It was a pretty easy process working with them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So how much text is there in the book with each photograph? I'm sorry, I haven't seen the book.
No problem. So the book is, I'm trying to remember how many photos are in there. There might be like, I don't know, let's say 130 different photos in there. And the way the book is set up is, there's an intro section where I sort of talk about like, why I'm interested in this and why I do it. And then it talks about, you know, factories, hospitals, military establishments, churches, theaters, other miscellaneous structures, schools. So for each section, there's, maybe 4 or 5 pages of text that provides some historical context to why these things exist in Massachusetts, with a couple of interesting anecdotes in each of them. But like, why are there abandoned factories? Why are there abandoned schools? In those 4 or 5 introductory pages, and then it's just a series of photos with very brief captions. I try not to identify any of the locations in the book. And then there's a conclusion. Um, so that's pretty much the structure that I set up. And again, I had the creative license to do that. And it took me a while to figure out like, how do I want to tell this story? And there were so many there were different building types that I thought it was important to touch on.
So that's basically that sounds like it comes from your architecture background in some ways that you
Yeah, but I hadn't thought about that, but yeah, you're probably right. Just because I was familiar with the building types and I know why an architecture of a hospital is uniquely different than a church or a school.
Yeah, that's right.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because somebody else might say, okay, I'm gonna categorize them by decade or something like that.
Sure, you could have done something like you could have categorized
No,
them
that's really
by,
interesting.
yeah.
You can. We have a question here, which actually aligns with the question that I had. And Kate Clip says, "Your bio." Kate, do you want to ask your own question?
Your bio says that you work in museum industry and do some design. Does that go hand in hand with this interest or influence it at all?
That's a great question. My work in exhibit design and museums was probably sparked by, again, my education in architecture and a love of history, which got me into museum planning, which is absolutely directly connected to my love of going in buildings. Because again, it's a connection of design, architecture, and history. So they're definitely connected.
It's really good to see people incorporate history in what they are doing. That's just really wonderful. Yeah, I have a similar question, and because I wanted to ask about the relationship between building a book and building an exhibit, and whether you feel that they are similar or they inform each other, whether you learned enough what you know about exhibit planning taught you how to put a book together.
Wow, that is such a cool question. So I think there's three things that come to mind there. Three similarities between the exhibit design and book. So the first thing is if whether you're designing an exhibit or writing a book, you need to make some assumptions or do some research or make some assumptions about the existing knowledge and context that your viewers, guests, readers are coming to your information, right? So in writing Abandoned Massachusetts, I had to write it with an assumption that people are coming to it with some existing knowledge of New England history, some existing knowledge about photography, right? Because you just simply can't back up to the beginning, just like you can't do that in exhibit. So you have to make some assumptions about what knowledge your readers or your guests are coming. The second thing that comes to mind is narrative structure, right? So in an exhibit design, we talk a lot about what is the storyline in an exhibit. So if somebody's entering your museum gallery, how are they introduced to the subject matter? And what is the storyline that they're going through? Are they going through a chronological experience? Are they going through a thematic experience? And then how do you conclude that gallery experience before you force them to the gift shop? So when you're writing the book, you sort of have to play in that figure out that narrative structure as well. And then the third thing that I think is similar is in an exhibit, um, whether it's with artifacts or images, there's a process of curation, of selecting what is going to be in there. Those of us in museum design know that when you go and visit a museum and you see a number of artifacts in cases or paintings on the wall, you're likely only seeing maybe 3 to 5% of the artifacts that museum actually has in its inventory, right? So when Hill Media asked me to put this book together, I probably went and they said, you can only have, let's say, 130 photos. I probably went through 5 or 6 different passes of deletion, right? Where I had to start with here's the ones that I think should be in there. And I had 600. Then I've got to go through again and trim it down to, it was down to 400. And I had to go through that curation process and throw away photos sometimes that I thought were incredibly beautiful photos,
Yeah.
but they didn't help support the story, right? And there are photos in my book that I think are average photos that I would have loved to, you know, transplant with a better photo, but it was important for the narrative structure that I set up just like an exhibit.
It's
And that,
it's a really interesting process
yeah.
between those choices, because I've done 4, they're small books, but I've done 4 of them, and the second one is called Beach, the fall and rise of a forest, and it's basically a love song to our forests here in New England. But at first I had thought I was going to, I photographed a lot of beach leaves, and there's stuff about beach leaves that fascinates me. So I had been working on beach leaves forever. And then I started seeing that I really, had other leaf photographs that and could I only have beach leaves, or should I also have other leaves? So the question of what is the cart and what is right, that really starts to drive what you're doing. Do you want to just only have the ones that you think are the best photos, or do you want the
Yep.
story? Is a
Right.
photograph all about telling the story? And that's a real photographer's choice that you have to, deal with. Hang on
Yeah.
one second.
Yeah. That's actually a really great question.
I'm sorry.
No, no problem. That was such a great question, Sue, and I appreciate it.
Yeah, so it's a frustrating process, but it's also, when you look back, it's kind of exciting in some ways that you have to look at things differently from the way you sort of want to half the time.
Yeah.
I have some very specific questions about publishing and working with the publisher, because this is a series on authors and publishing in Massachusetts, or in Massachusetts history, and so
Yeah.
I'm kind of hoping for people, after looking at looking at this series, that they'll be able to compare publishing processes with different publishers, but also different kinds of processes, anywhere
Yeah.
from self-publishing to having some kind of really fancy academic publisher, right?
Yep.
So I have a whole row of questions that I would like to just walk through with you very quickly. Some of which is a
I'll
little
do my
bit
best.
repetitive. Hmm?
I'll do my best.
Okay, good. So you said that, so you didn't have to go to Fonthill, they came to you
Correct.
with the series. So that's already a given. But so when you were working with them, were they hard to get in touch with, or easy?
Uh, they were mildly hard to get in touch with. But it wasn't, I mean, I'll be honest, I didn't find that extremely frustrating because um, the deadline was reasonable, and it's not like I was, waiting for some, $10,000 advance. So I didn't have a lot resting on it.
Uh-huh.
So, but
Um,
they were sometimes difficult to get in touch with.
right. So they came to you. So if they have a vetting process, you did not go through it. You did not go to them, and
That's correct. Yep.
that's right. So
Yep.
we don't know whether they have a vetting process. Did they
Right.
provide?
I mean, to that point, it's certainly possible that I went through a vetting process and wasn't aware of it, and that's why, and then they reached out. I have no idea.
Right, right, right.
Yeah.
A lot of publishers, have a whole thing that you have to go through before they will even talk to you, so that
Yeah.
you noticed.
Yeah.
Um, did they provide you with clear guidelines and clear goals for what they wanted? And did that sort of, were you able to negotiate any differences when you needed them and stuff like
I
that?
didn't need any differences. Their guidelines were clear. I mean, they gave me, an approximate word count that they wanted me to hit, a number of photos. They told me exactly the way the writing needed to be formatted, if I was including any footnotes or things like that. They told me exactly how the copy and the photos needed to be delivered to them.
Yeah,
Um, so it was fairly easy, and then there were, design related things like the cover. They asked me to provide maybe, 4 or 5 different potential photos for the cover so that their graphic designer could play around with them a little bit. So I did
yeah.
that, and I think I recall that I may have had a comment on one of them, and they made the change pretty quickly. So, and there were very clear guidelines, and it was easy to meet them, still with giving me enough creative license about how I wanted to structure the storyline.
And this is Fonthill Publishing, and the series is America Through Time, and within
Right.
that they have the abandoned Union, I think the series is called.
Yeah, that's right.
Um, did you have to edit your own manuscript, or did they do that for you?
Um,
I'm saying final copy editing.
yeah, final copy. There was very little editing. I mean, the copy that I gave them, I can pat myself on the back, was pretty darn solid. They got back to me with a couple of questions. They wanted to make sure that, like, is this word accurate? Because my editors were also in England as well. So, they asked about the accuracy of some of the words, or sentence structure. I think they spotted a couple of things and made some recommendations, but there wasn't much, and it was pretty easy. So,
But also
so
you had
again,
to do a lot of editing beforehand to make it close to perfect.
that's right. And and I serendipitously, I have some members of my family that are also published authors or have worked in the publishing industry. So I was able to give my copy to them for proofing before I gave it to the editor at Fonthill.
Yeah. So what's convenient is that if you have a book that doesn't have that many words, that's easier to do when you know
Of course, yes, yes, of
font
course,
enough format. Good.
yeah.
Um, so I assume you did not have to pay to publish with them.
No, I did not. I do have I mean, I did like, after I did that book and then it was like, then we were all trapped in our houses and I felt like doing another one. So I have this other one called Lost Colors that
Yeah.
I did self-publish. So, and, I paid some money for it. I sold a number of copies and now I have a bunch and I give them to friends.
Well,
So,
the next question is going to relate to that. Now I give them to friends,
yeah.
which is about PR. Tell me about PR. Who does what? What did you do? What did they do? Did it work?
So, I mean, I the only story there is so my book was published in the very convenient month of February 2020.
Yes.
Right? Um, and once it was after it was published, I actually did have some readings and speaking engagements set up with some various local bookstores and local libraries in Eastern Massachusetts. And then March 2020 came along, and all of that was canceled. Um, I did, and what the publisher sent me was, piles and piles of bookmarks, stickers that said like signed by author that I could put on the cover of books. They sent me, I think, I think they may have sent me like 200 copies of the book just for me to do my own sales with. They also sent me some posters for potential like readings at, at a bookstore or library to like hang up at those things, but they had no use. So all of those things got canceled. The publisher wasn't doing any promotion beyond that because that's all they typically do. So I had to figure out ways to self promote. So we were all trapped in our homes. I'm going to share my screen again because this was kind of fun. So I did a couple of things. When the book went out, a number of friends and family members bought the book, of course. So I did. Let me share this. Can you guys see this?
Yeah.
So So I reached out to everybody that had bought a book and said, "Can you send me a photo of yourself reading a book?" And I got some funny stuff back. Some of them were very serious. Some of them were like, my friend sitting on a toilet or my friend asleep, et cetera, et cetera. I would use these photos on Instagram and LinkedIn and Facebook to promote my book, and I would get a ton of additional sales from there. And then also because all of my book signings and readings got canceled, I decided to have my own at home all by myself. So I hung up one of my posters and I put on a sport coat and poured myself some wine. And my my son who was still living at home at the time came to my book signing and I signed one copy for him. But then I took these photos and I put those on social media and just to sort of, make a laugh out of the whole experience and be like, yeah, my readings got canceled. So I had this cute little reading at home. So buy my book. And it worked out. I got a ton of purchases from just constantly promoting it in the spring of 2020.
Oh, good for you. Did
Yeah,
they
and I mean
did they
the
give
truth,
you
like,
any guidelines about how to do PR at all?
no, zero.
Okay, so
No.
PR is not really their thing, huh?
No, it was, I mean, it was, they gave me their mark materials like the stickers and the posters
Right. Yeah.
and the bookmarks, but beyond that, no real guidance. Fortunately, you know, I also work in sales and marketing, so I knew enough to be dangerous.
I love your idea of taking a photograph, having people take a photograph with your book.
Yeah, it
It's
was good. It
really,
was good fun because again, I got people were sending me all kinds of crazy stuff.
yeah, that's really nice. Good
Yeah.
job. Good job.
Thank you. And
Um,
it wasn't until probably 2021 when people started kind of coming back out of the woodwork with masks on that I
yeah,
got invited to two book signings. One was at a small independent store in Webster, Massachusetts, and then another one was, oh God, it was a library, and I can't remember where the library was.
okay.
So
So one thing that I've been trying to do is I've been trying to give author events at libraries. And so
yeah,
I've written to all the libraries in Massachusetts, and I get really very few responses. Is in the end. I mean, I've done a bunch around here, but in the end, I get very few responses. Maybe I'm not doing a good job, but you know. But it's fun to do those things. It's really fun to go to them and talk to people and things like that.
it
Um,
is. And I
so
tell you, in my experience of the two in-person um, uh, presentations that I did, and then I've done this is probably the fourth or fifth online when I've done for different organizations. Most people show up to hear ghost stories.
because of the
So
ghost stories?
just because of the subject matter of the book, they're
Oh,
looking to
right,
hear like eerie stories
right.
about things I saw or
Oh,
heard in
really?
buildings. So
Oh, interesting.
yeah,
I didn't realize that. Otherwise, I would have asked you more specifically about ghosts.
no, I don't have any, so we're good.
Well, you do have the story about the one place that was supposed to have a
That's
lot of
right.
that. So, so you said you did a lot of social media outreach. Did they help you with blurbs and PR texts or not?
No, I actually ended
You
up
wrote
writing.
all that yourself?
I wrote some for them. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
And
for their own mark.
they asked you to do that. They asked you
They
to
asked
help.
me to, yeah, they asked me to do that, and
Uh-huh.
it was fine. Frankly, I enjoyed it.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Um, is there anything else you want to say about the publishing process that you know that you want to that you feel like if you have other authors, you know, but
I guess I
did you
mean,
learn something that you wish you'd known or
well, I mean, I know this isn't helpful because again, I think I didn't know much about publishing before I went into it, and I probably still don't because again, I didn't have to put a pitch together to encourage a publisher to pick up my book, which I understand is quite an effort and usually means that you get littered with rejection letters. So again, I never I never actively pursued the book. The book came to me. So again,
right.
I kind of got lucky in that regards.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think the only thing that the thing that I learned is that in a book series like Abandoned Massachusetts, and I suspect other sort of America Through Time books, is nobody's getting rich. My annual royalty check, which usually comes in March every year, is somewhere between 60 and $100. So
Yes, I got $73 from Amazon.
so there you go. So I can buy one steak.
So
Yeah.
I forgot to ask one of my questions, and since I'm committed to asking everyone the same questions about the concrete ones about the question, did you have to do the layout at all, or did they? In other words, did you say this text goes here on this page and this goes here? They did all of
No,
that.
I did not. No, they did the full layout, and
Okay.
that's a good question, Plune. It gets back to like how the editorial process worked.
Yeah.
I made more comments on their layout than they made comments on my copy.
Yeah.
So,
Okay, but it's good that you were able to, you know, give.
yeah, I mean, because I've got some graphic design experience as well, and I'm a little bit anal retentive with my visual work. So they would lay out the photographs in a certain way, and I would tell them like, don't put this one next to that, or this is too small. Can we
Yeah.
change it a little bit? So,
Great.
yeah.
Are you planning another book?
I'm not, but if, if somebody comes at me with an interesting idea, it would certainly be a fun project to work on. It's just I've, got other hobbies I'm working on.
So what
So
are you doing in photography now?
more
Or
abandoned stuff.
abandoned?
Yep,
Hmm.
yes, more abandoned stuff. I mentioned the photographer that I was hanging out with this past weekend in Illinois. So I actually just returned from 2 days in Southern Illinois. Um, Went into like two theaters, a hospital, a couple of houses, um, a shoe factory, and an abandoned antique dealer. Um, the country is littered with these places. So I had a wonderful excursion, and I've got hundreds of photos that I need to edit now.
Hmm. And now
Yeah.
and then you'll figure out what to do with them.
Yep. And
So we'll
and
put
and I
them on
might
your
do
website.
I might do nothing more than post them on social media because I get so excited about people seeing them.
Uh-huh. So
Yeah.
you wouldn't be putting them on in your portfolio on your website?
Some of them, some
Yeah.
select ones I might put on portfolio. Oh, Miss Clip, that is a great question. I am going to put my
Oh, yes, of course. And that's something that should
yeah,
tell me that I should I should ask for a
yeah, yeah. Thank
hiker
you for
biker.
asking.
Oh, there's
And
a whole
just so
biker question in
So
there.
for the yeah for the folks that are still here, if you're on Instagram, that is my handle.
Yeah, we'll
M A
probably
hiker
send
biker.
it the chat around to a lot of people, to a lot
All
of
right.
people.
All right.
So
Thank you, Glenn.
so now here's a question that just came up for me, and that's probably gonna be one of my last questions. And that is when you put a photograph up on that website and somebody
Yeah.
orders it. Now this
Yeah.
is a photographer question and not a history question.
Yeah.
Uh, uh, do you print it? Somebody else print it? Who prints it?
I don't know. I don't print them. They go to whatever house Smug Mug prints them in. A lot of photographers have their websites set up that you can just easily get in and order a print. Um, and you can do that on my Smug Mug site as well. But more often than not, I prefer that people write to me and ask me and tell me what are you looking for because I want to make sure that I can size a photo correctly for whatever frame you're trying to put it into, right? Or the space you're trying to put it into, and I can customize your size and make sure that the resolution works pretty easily. So
Yeah,
again,
well, yeah,
you can buy stuff directly from the site. You could probably also buy a keychain with one of my photos on it. But it's better when people just reach out to me directly and say, "Can I get a print of this?" And then I work back and forth with them to make sure I get them the right thing.
yeah. I agree with you on having not that it's more fun to be able to work with someone
Yeah.
and make the print. Well,
And if
thank you so
and actually just real quick, Plume, to that point, I when I do that, I also always ask people, will you send me a photo of the space that you hung it in? And I've got a whole series of photos where people have, they've hung up one of my photos in their office, or they gave one of my photos as a gift to their wife, and she's hung it in her office space. So those are always fun to see.
Yeah, and I ask that sometimes too, and I forget to always do it, and I think it's a good idea because
Yeah,
it gives people a sense of what it looks like,
yeah,
what it might look like. Well,
yeah.
thank you so much for being part of this and talking with me. I was very curious about what it would be like to publish with America Through Time. They have a more generalized history series that is more regional as well. So
That's
you
right.
can always try to do a book for that, you know, or make one abandoned Cape Cod or abandoned something that.
I've got some
Uh,
good Cape Cod stuff.
I want to ask everybody to and thank you for sticking with us and for being here today. I want to thank you, Lindsay, for being our IT person. I want to remind you that coming up on March 21st, we have actually a conversation with two publishers. Um, with Mary Doherty from UMass Press, and of course someone whose name I can't remember anymore from Arcadia Press, which is is the other big history publisher, and we're going to be talking from what it looks like from their point of view, and maybe see if they have some pointers about publishing. And then on April 2nd, we're having a conversation with Elizabeth Sheehan, whose book I am just in the middle of reading, but she bought a house on Woods Hole, and through the house got interested in the history of Woods Hole, and so she's telling the history of Woods Hole through the family that built the house and the house itself. People who
There is
lived.
just incidentally, there is one Woods Hole abandoned structure in my book. There's
Okay,
there's an abandoned Buckminster Fuller dome in Woods Hole.
cool.
Very cool.
Have you ever, do you
No.
put a hard hat on when you go into these places?
Pardon?
Do you put a hard hat on?
No, I'm like very irresponsible. I don't put any hard hat on. I don't wear any masks. No, I'm horrible.
Thank you very much, and thank you all.